January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Philippines. The morning sun beat down on twisted metal. Captain Thomas Watson walked slowly around the captured Japanese bomber, his boots crunching on the gravel apron. The Mitsubishi G4M Type 1 land-based attack bomber sat silent on the tarmac, its twin engines cold. Allied pilots called it the Betty. Watson was about to understand why they also called it the Flying Lighter. He climbed through the fuselage access hatch with 3 other Army Air Force's technical intelligence officers. The interior smelled of aviation fuel, oil, and the lingering scent of combat. Watson moved toward the wing route, where engineering drawings indicated the main fuel tanks were located. He ran his hand along the aluminum fuel tank wall. His fingers felt nothing but thin metal. No rubberized self-sealing compound. No protective armor plating. No fire suppression system. Just bare aluminum, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating 9,000 liters of high-octane fuel from the outside world. "There's nothing here," Watson said to Lieutenant Robert Chen, the structures analyst beside him. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," Chen asked, leaning closer with his flashlight. "No protection, no self-sealing tanks, no armor, nothing." The 2 officers stared at each other in the dim fuselage, trying to process what they were seeing. Every American bomber, every single one, had self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment since 1941. The technology used layers of rubber compound that would swell and seal bullet holes automatically. It wasn't perfect, but it dramatically reduced fire risk and gave crews a fighting chance. Watson moved to the next one. Same story. He checked the fuselage tanks. Identical construction. Chen examined the wing tanks from below, looking for armor plating that might protect them from ground fire. There was none. The tanks were completely exposed to any bullet or shell fragment that penetrated the thin skin. "They built a bomber with the fuel tanks completely unprotected," Watson said quietly. "That can't be right," Chen replied. "Maybe this is a prototype or a stripped-down reconnaissance variant." Watson checked the airframe data plate near the cockpit. Serial number indicated this was a standard production G4M Model 11. This wasn't an experimental aircraft or a special mission variant. This was a frontline operational bomber. Major William Schneider, the senior technical intelligence officer, joined them in the fuselage. He'd been examining the cockpit instrumentation and defensive armament positions. "Gentlemen, I need you to see something else," Schneider said, gesturing toward the tail gunner's position. The 3 officers crawled aft through the narrow fuselage tunnel. The tail gun position was exposed, with minimal armor protection for the gunner. The gunner sat directly between 2 large unprotected fuel tanks. "If anyone shoots at this aircraft from behind," Schneider observed, "the bullets pass through the gunner and into fuel tanks." "It's a flying bomb," Chen said. "One tracer round anywhere near those tanks and the whole aircraft goes up." Watson returned to the wing tanks and began measuring the aluminum thickness with calipers. 1.8 millimeters on average, thinner than the skin on some American aircraft fuel tanks, which also had protection. He calculated quickly. A 50 caliber machine gun round would penetrate this aluminum like tissue paper. Even a 30 caliber round from 1,000 yards would punch straight through. And if that round was an incendiary or tracer, which most American fighters used, ignition was virtually guaranteed. "How is this possible?" Chen asked. "The Japanese aren't stupid. They know what happens when fuel tanks get hit." Schneider had found the aircraft's technical manual in the cockpit. Written in Japanese, one of the Filipino-American interpreters was translating key sections. "Sir, you need to hear this," the interpreter called from outside the aircraft. The officers climbed out and gathered around as the interpreter read from the manual. "It says here that the unprotected tanks are deliberate. The weight savings allows for maximum range capability." The interpreter continued. "The design specification called for a combat radius exceeding 3,000 kilometers. Watson did the mental arithmetic. 3,000 kilometers combat radius meant 6,000 kilometers total range. That was nearly twice the range of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. They traded crew protection for range," Schneider said slowly. "Deliberately. It wasn't a design flaw or manufacturing shortcut. It wasn't inferior technology or lack of knowledge. Japanese engineers had made a calculated decision. Range mattered more than crew survival. Watson thought about the dozens of Betty bombers he'd seen shot down over the Philippines. How they always seemed to explode into flames instantly. How few Japanese airmen ever bailed out. Now he understood why. The Betty wasn't just vulnerable, it was designed to be vulnerable. Every kilogram of armor, every liter of self-sealing compound, every protective system, all of it sacrificed for range. The bomber could reach targets no Allied aircraft could touch in 1941, but once intercepted by fighters, it became a flying crematorium for its crew. Captain Watson looked at the silent bomber sitting peacefully in the tropical sun. This aircraft represented a philosophy completely alien to American military thinking. American doctrine prioritized bringing crews home. Japanese doctrine prioritized reaching the target. Get photographs of everything, Schneider ordered. Detailed measurements of the fuel system. I want a complete technical report. Washington is going to want to know why we've been shooting down so many of these things. Chen made a bitter sound. Because they built them to burn. The captured Betty would be disassembled, analyzed, and documented over the following weeks. But Watson already understood the essential truth he'd discovered in those unprotected fuel tanks. The Japanese had built a brilliant bomber that could strike targets across vast distances of the Pacific, and they'd built it knowing that most of the crews who flew it would die burning. That choice, range over survival, was about to make perfect, terrible sense. The story of the Betty's unprotected fuel tanks began years before Pearl Harbor in the naval staff rooms of Tokyo. 1937. The Imperial Japanese Navy faced a strategic problem that would shape their entire aviation doctrine. Japan's potential enemies, America, Britain, the Soviet Union, controlled territories scattered across the vast Pacific Ocean. Any future war would require striking targets thousands of kilometers from Japanese bases. The Pacific wasn't like Europe, where airfields sat relatively close together and fighters could escort bombers throughout their missions. Here, distances were measured in thousands of kilometers across open ocean. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood this geographical reality better than most. He had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew American industrial power. He knew Japan couldn't win a prolonged war. The only hope was a swift, decisive offensive that would destroy enemy capability before America's factories could respond. That required bombers with unprecedented range. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued Specification 12C for a new land-based attack bomber. The requirements seemed impossible. Carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs, or torpedoes over 3,700 kilometers. For comparison, the American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had a range of approximately 3,200 kilometers. The B-17 achieved that with a crew of 10, heavy armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Japanese specification called for matching that range with a crew of 7 in a much lighter airframe. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries accepted the challenge. Chief designer Kiro Honjo led the engineering team. Honjo was brilliant, methodical, and understood the brutal mathematics of aircraft design. Every kilogram added to an aircraft reduced its range. Every piece of armor meant less fuel capacity. Self-sealing fuel tanks used rubber compounds that added significant weight, approximately 150 kilograms for a bomber. Armor plating around fuel tanks could add another 200 kilograms. Fire suppression systems, protected fuel lines, redundant systems each added weight. Honjo calculated that protecting the fuel system would reduce range by approximately 800 kilometers. 800 kilometers meant the difference between reaching American bases in the Philippines or falling short. It meant the difference between striking the British fleet off Malaya or watching helplessly from shore. The choice was stark. Build a protected bomber with limited range, or build an unprotected bomber that could reach distant targets. Admiral Yamamoto and the Naval General Staff made their decision. Range mattered more than protection. Offense mattered more than defense. The reasoning followed Japanese naval doctrine, which emphasized decisive offensive action over defensive capability. Japanese battleships sacrificed armor for speed and firepower. Japanese destroyers were floating arsenals with minimal protection. The philosophy extended from surface vessels to aircraft. Strike first, strike hard, reach the enemy before he reaches you. American philosophy differed fundamentally. The United States Army Air Corps prioritized crew survival alongside mission capability. Self-sealing fuel tanks became mandatory on all American combat aircraft after 1940. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name from heavy defensive armament and armor protection. American doctrine recognized that trained crews were more valuable than aircraft. You could build a new bomber in months. Training a replacement crew took years. Protecting experienced airmen meant they could fly multiple missions, gaining skill and knowledge with each sortie. The Japanese calculation was different. If the war could be won quickly through overwhelming offensive power, crew survival became secondary. A bomber that could destroy an enemy base 3,000 kilometers away was worth more than crew protection. Even if that bomber and its crew survived only 1 or 2 missions, Honjo's design team worked within these parameters. The Mitsubishi G4M took shape on drawing boards. 2 Mitsubishi Casei 14-cylinder air-cooled radial engines, each producing 1,530 horsepower. Twin-engine configuration for redundancy, but no armor around the engines. Fuel capacity, 9,000 liters distributed across multiple unprotected tanks in wings and fuselage. Maximum range, 6,000 kilometers at economical cruise speed. Combat radius with 1,000 kilogram bomb load, 3,700 kilometers. The numbers were extraordinary. No contemporary bomber anywhere in the world could match this range. But the weight savings came entirely from eliminating protection. Fuel tanks were simple aluminum containers. No self-sealing compounds. No inert gas systems. No armor plating. No fire suppression beyond basic handheld extinguishers. The crew compartment had minimal armor. The gunner positions were exposed. Even the defensive armament was light. Type 92 7.7mm machine guns and 120mm cannon. Insufficient firepower to drive off determined fighter attacks. The prototype flew on October 23, 1939. Test pilots reported excellent range and handling. The Navy accepted the design enthusiastically. Production began immediately at Mitsubishi plants. By December 1941, approximately 160 G4M bombers were operational. They would soon prove their extraordinary range capability in combat. But they would also prove the fatal cost of Honjo's design choices. The unprotected fuel tanks that enabled 6,000-kilometer missions would turn each aircraft into a flying bomb. 1 bullet, 1 spark, 1 tracer round. That's all it took. The Betty could reach targets no other bomber could touch. But it couldn't protect the men who flew it. 1937. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Factory, Nagoya. The future was taking shape in wind tunnels and on drafting tables. Chief designer Kiro Honjo studied the Navy's 12-sheath specification with the intensity of a man solving an impossible equation. 3,700 kilometers combat radius, 1,000 kilograms ordnance, crew of 7, maximum speed over 400 kilometers per hour. The numbers demanded innovation. More accurately, they demanded sacrifice. Honjo had designed the G3M Nell bomber, the Betty's predecessor. He understood the compromises intimately. The Nell had reasonable range, but was slow, poorly armed, and already obsolete before production ended. This new design had to be revolutionary. It had to change the rules of strategic bombing. The Mitsubishi design team worked through 1938, refining aerodynamics and weight calculations. They chose the Mitsubishi Casei engine, a 14-cylinder air-cooled radial producing 1,530 horsepower. 2 engines mounted on a mid-wing configuration. Clean aerodynamics with smooth engine cowlings and minimal drag. The fuselage was cigar-shaped, streamlined, with a glazed nose for the bombardier navigator. Total length, 20 meters. Wingspan, 25 meters. Height, 6 meters. The team calculated every gram. Aluminum alloy construction throughout. Flush rivets, to reduce drag. Fuel capacity was critical. They installed tanks in the wing roots, inner wings, and fuselage sections. Total capacity 9,160 liters of high-octane aviation gasoline. That fuel weighed approximately 6,800 kilograms when fully loaded. Add engines, airframe, crew, defensive armament, and ordnance. The maximum takeoff weight reached 12,500 kilograms. For comparison, the American B-17 Flying Fortress weighed 29,000 kilograms fully loaded. The Betty achieved comparable range at less than half the weight. The savings came from one source: protection. No armor plating around engines, cockpit, or fuel tanks. No self-sealing fuel systems. Minimal defensive armament. The defensive guns were almost an afterthought. One Type 99 20mm cannon in the tail, 4 Type 92 7.7mm machine guns, 1 in the nose, 1 dorsal, 2 in waist positions. Total defensive firepower pathetic compared to the 1350 caliber machine guns on a B-17. But guns and ammunition added weight. Every kilogram of ammunition was 1 less kilogram of fuel. The first prototype rolled out in September 1939, bare metal finish, Imperial Japanese Navy markings. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Katsuji Kondo climbed into the cockpit on October 23. The Keisei engines roared to life. Kondo advanced the throttles and the bomber accelerated down the runway. Rotation speed 160 kilometers per hour. The Betty lifted smoothly into autumn sky. Kondo later reported, "The aircraft handles beautifully. Responsive controls, stable in cruise. The range calculations appear accurate." What he didn't mention, because it wasn't part of the test criteria, was vulnerability. Early test flights occurred without combat simulation. No one shot at the prototype. The Navy conducted acceptance trials through late 1939 and early 1940. Range tests validated Honjo's calculations. The Betty could fly 6,000 kilometers at economical cruise settings. Speed trials showed maximum velocity of 428 kilometers per hour at 4,600 meters altitude. Service ceiling 9,100 meters. Respectable performance for a land-based bomber. The Navy ordered the aircraft into production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber. Allied intelligence would later designate it with the reporting name Betty, following the practice of giving female names to Japanese bombers. Production began at 3 facilities: Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant, Mitsubishi's Okayama plant, and the Naval Arsenal at Hiro. By December 1941, production had reached approximately 160 aircraft. The Takao Air Group received the first operational Bettys in September 1941. Crews trained in formation flying, navigation over water, and torpedo attack procedures. Warrant Officer Haruki Iki flew early training missions from Taiwan. The aircraft was a pilot's dream. Long range. Good speed. We could reach targets the Americans thought were safe. The only concern was fuel management. We carried enough fuel to fly for 12 hours. One mistake in navigation meant ditching in the ocean. The lack of protection wasn't immediately apparent to crews. In peacetime training, no one shot at them. The thin aluminum fuel tanks seemed adequate. The minimal defensive armament seemed sufficient. Japanese doctrine emphasized attacking before being attacked. Why worry about defense when offense was overwhelming? By November 1941, Betty bombers were deployed to bases throughout the Pacific. The Takao Air Group in Taiwan, the Kanoya Air Group in southern Kyushu, the Mihoro Air Group near Hiroshima. Approximately 200 Betty bombers were operational when war began. They were the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary land-based striking force, the weapon that would reach across thousands of kilometers to destroy enemy fleets and bases. Crews were confident. Officers were enthusiastic. Admirals were pleased with their new capability. December 8, 1941, was approaching. The bombers would soon prove their extraordinary range. But they would also begin proving something else. Something Kiro Honjo's calculations had always predicted. In combat, unprotected fuel tanks don't just reduce survivability, they guarantee casualties. The Betty could reach distant targets, but it couldn't bring its crews home. December 8, 1941. 0300 hours. Takao Air Base, Taiwan. Engines coughed to life in darkness. 53 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers sat on the flight line, their engines warming in the tropical night. Each bomber carried 60-kilogram fragmentation bombs and incendiary clusters. The target: Clark Field, Luzon, Philippines. Lieutenant Masaharu Ibasuki climbed into his Betty's cockpit with his 6 crew members. They had rehearsed this mission dozens of times. 800 kilometers across the ocean to destroy American air power. The distance was nothing for the Betty. At cruise speed, the flight would take approximately 2.5 hours. American bases in the Philippines were supposed to be beyond Japanese bomber range. That assumption was about to be shattered. 0345 hours. The first Betty bombers rolled down the runway and lifted into the darkness. Formation after formation followed. 53 bombers, 371 Japanese aviators heading toward war. 0600 hours. The formations crossed the Philippine coast. Fighter escorts, Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, joined from forward base. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, unlimited visibility. Navigation was exact. Lieutenant Ibasuki could see Clark Field from 40 kilometers away. Dozens of American aircraft sat parked on the field. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters, all neatly arranged in rows. The Americans had received word of the Pearl Harbor attack hours earlier, yet their aircraft remained parked, exposed, vulnerable. Miscommunication, confusion, and disbelief had prevented immediate dispersal. The Americans were about to pay catastrophically. 01230 hours. The first Betty bombers rolled into their attack runs from 4,000 meters altitude. Bombardiers centered their targets. Bomb bay doors opened. The 60-kilogram bombs fell away in clusters. The explosions began before Ibasuki's bomber reached the release point. Massive fireballs erupted across Clark Field as bombs detonated among parked aircraft. B-17 bombers exploded spectacularly as bombs penetrated their fuel tanks. Burning gasoline spread across the concrete. P-40 fighters disintegrated under direct hits. Hangars collapsed in flames. Fuel storage tanks detonated. Ibasuki released his bombs and banked away. Behind him, Clark Field was disappearing under smoke and fire. Wave after wave of Betty bombers made their runs. The bombing continued for nearly 90 minutes. American anti-aircraft guns fired desperately. Black puffs of flak dotted the sky around the Japanese formations. Several P-40 fighters managed to take off and engage the bombers. Second Lieutenant Joseph Moore climbed his P-40 through the smoke and dove on a Betty formation. He lined up a bomber in his gun sight and pressed the firing button. 650 caliber machine guns hammered. Tracers arced toward the Betty. Moore saw his rounds strike the fuselage and wing root. The Betty didn't explode. It didn't catch fire. It continued flying, apparently undamaged. Moore's ammunition load was mostly ball rounds, solid bullets without incendiary compounds. They punched holes through the Betty's thin aluminum skin, but failed to ignite the fuel tanks. The bomber turned slowly toward Taiwan, trailing a thin stream of fuel from punctured tanks. Not every Betty was so fortunate. Lieutenant Boyd Wagner, also flying a P-40, caught another Betty with a burst that included incendiary tracers. The tracers struck the wing root. The fuel tanks ignited instantly. The Betty transformed into a fireball. Flames engulfed the fuselage in seconds. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged toward the ground. No parachutes emerged. The 7-man crew died before they could react. The bomber impacted in jungle and exploded. Wagner broke away, searching for another target. He understood now, hit these bombers in the right place, and they burned. But most P-40 fighters never reached engagement altitude. The bombing had been too quick, too overwhelming. On the ground, Clark Field was devastated. 17 B-17 bombers destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 56 P-40 fighters destroyed. Hangars, fuel storage, ammunition dumps, all burning or destroyed. 80 American personnel killed. 150 wounded. American air power in the Philippines was crippled. The Betty bombers turned for home. Most suffered no damage. A few had bullet holes that maintenance crews could patch. 2 bombers failed to return. One was Lieutenant Wagner's kill. Another was damaged by anti-aircraft fire and ditched at sea. 14 Japanese aviators died, against American losses exceeding 200 aircraft and personnel. The mission was a spectacular success. The Betty had proven its range capability and striking power. Lieutenant Ibasuki landed back at Takao after 6 hours in the air. The Betty had flown 1,600 kilometers round trip. No American bomber could have made that strike. The B-17 lacked the range from any available base. Japanese commanders were ecstatic. The unprotected fuel tanks had been worth the risk. But several officers noted something troubling in the mission reports. The two Bettys that were lost had caught fire instantly when hit properly. No time for crews to bail out. American fighters with incendiary ammunition could destroy Bettys with single bursts. The aluminum fuel tanks provided no protection whatsoever. A well-aimed burst meant certain death. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed the Clark Field mission. He wrote in his report, "The Type 1 attack bomber performs admirably. Range and payload exceed expectations. Concern vulnerability to fighter attack if fuel tanks are struck. Recommend tactical procedures to minimize exposure." The concern was noted and ignored. The Betty had succeeded brilliantly in its first combat mission. That success obscured the fundamental vulnerability that would soon become apparent. The Americans at Clark Field had been surprised, unprepared, and armed mostly with ball ammunition. Future battles would be different. American fighters would carry full incendiary loads, and they would learn exactly where to aim. December 10th, 1941. 0600 hours. Saigon, French Indochina. The order had arrived at midnight. British Force Z was steaming off the Malayan coast. Two capital ships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, the newest British battleship and a veteran battlecruiser, hunting for Japanese invasion convoys. Admiral Tom Phillips commanded Force C from Prince of Wales. He believed his ships were immune to air attack. Capital ships had never been sunk by aircraft while underway and actively defending themselves. Japanese naval aviation was about to prove that belief catastrophically wrong. Kanoya Air Group and Mihoro Air Group received the mission: sink Force Z before it reached the invasion beaches. 85 Betty bombers and Bell bombers prepared for launch. Some carried torpedoes, others carried bombs. The target was approximately 700 kilometers away, across the Gulf of Thailand. Lieutenant Haruki Iki climbed into his Betty carrying a Type 91 aerial torpedo. The torpedo weighed 800 kilograms. It would run at 70 kilometers per hour after release. Its warhead contained 205 kilograms of explosive, enough to tear open a battleship's hull. But delivering it required flying low, slow, and straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. 0900 hours. The first Betty formations lifted off and turned southeast. The weather deteriorated as they crossed the Gulf. Cloud cover thickened, visibility dropped. Finding two ships in thousands of square kilometers of ocean seemed impossible. But Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had shadowed Force Z since dawn, radioing position reports. 1100 hours. Lieutenant Iki's formation spotted the British ships through gaps in the clouds. Prince of Wales and Repulse steamed in company, their massive guns elevated against air attack. 4 destroyers accompanied them. All were making full speed, maneuvering to avoid submarines. The Japanese formation split. High-level bombers would attack first, forcing the ships to maneuver. Then torpedo bombers would strike from multiple directions simultaneously. Overwhelming defenses. 11-13 hours. The first wave of high-level bombers began their runs from 3,000 meters. Prince of Wales opened fire. Her anti-aircraft guns created a wall of steel and explosions. 14-centimeter guns. Pom-pom auto cannons. Machine guns. The sky filled with black bursts and tracers. The bombers pressed through. 25-kilogram bombs fell away. Most missed. Hitting a moving ship was extraordinarily difficult. But one bomb struck Prince of Wales aft. It penetrated the deck and exploded near the stern. The damage seemed minor. The battleship continued maneuvering, her guns still firing. Admiral Phillips radioed Singapore. Enemy aircraft bombing, no serious damage. He didn't know the bomb had damaged the battleship's propeller shaft, creating vibration that would worsen. 1140 hours. Lieutenant Iki's torpedo bomber formation approached from the east. 9 Betty bombers flew in line astern, 50 meters above the waves. Prince of Wales turned to present her narrow bow toward the approaching torpedoes. Iki released his torpedo at 800 meters range. The Type 91 dropped away and accelerated. White wakes marked 8 more torpedoes converging on the battleship from multiple angles. Prince of Wales couldn't evade them all. She was too large, too slow to turn. 11:44 hours. The first torpedo struck Prince of Wales's port side amidships. The explosion tore a massive hole below the waterline. Thousands of tons of seawater poured in. The battleship immediately listed to port. Her speed dropped. Power failed to some compartments. A second torpedo struck moments later, then a third. Each impact drove tons of water into the hull. The damage control teams fought desperately, but the flooding was catastrophic. Prince of Wales was dying. Her list increased to 23 degrees. She began settling by the stern. Meanwhile, Repulse maneuvered frantically under her own aerial assault. The battlecruiser's captain, William Tennant, handled his ship brilliantly. Turning, accelerating, dodging. For 30 minutes, Repulse avoided every torpedo. Her crew cheered each successful evasion. The 12-15 hours brought a new wave of Betty torpedo bombers. This time they attacked from 4 directions simultaneously. Repulse couldn't dodge them all. The first torpedo struck her port side. The explosion killed dozens of crew members instantly. Repulse shuddered but continued maneuvering. Her guns never stopped firing. A second torpedo hit, then a third and fourth in rapid succession. Water poured through multiple breaches. The battlecruiser's boiler rooms flooded. Power failed. Repulse slowed, her list increasing rapidly. Captain Tennant gave the order to abandon ship. 12:23 hours. Repulse rolled onto her side and sank. 851 crew members died. Prince of Wales was also finished. Her list approached 60 degrees. She was clearly doomed. Admiral Phillips and Captain John Leach remained on the bridge as their ship capsized. 12:50 hours. Prince of Wales rolled over and sank. 327 men died with her. The destroyers rescued survivors from the oil-covered water. Japanese aircraft circled overhead but didn't strafe. Lieutenant Iki watched the battleship sink beneath the waves. He had helped kill a capital ship. The Betty formations turned for home. They had been in combat for nearly 4 hours. Every bomber returned safely. Not a single Betty had been shot down. The British anti-aircraft fire had been intense, but largely ineffective against the maneuvering bombers. Total Japanese losses: 3 aircraft damaged, 0 destroyed, 0 casualties. Against that, 2 British capital ships sunk, 1,178 British sailors dead. The battle lasted 90 minutes from first attack to Prince of Wales sinking. It was the most devastating demonstration of naval air power in history. Japanese commanders were stunned by the completeness of their victory. The Betty had sunk ships that battleships and submarines had failed to destroy. British naval supremacy in Asian waters was shattered. Singapore's defense was compromised. The psychological impact was enormous. If capital ships weren't safe from air attack, naval warfare had changed forever. But Lieutenant Iki noticed something during the mission that troubled him. The British anti-aircraft fire had hit several Bettys. Most damage was minor, a few holes in wings or fuselage. One bomber took hits near the fuel tanks. The bullets punched through, but didn't ignite the fuel. Pure luck. If those rounds had been incendiaries, the bomber would have exploded. The British ships had been firing mostly high-explosive anti-aircraft ammunition, not incendiaries, against fighters with incendiary-loaded machine guns. The outcome might have been catastrophic. Iki filed his report noting the vulnerability. He recommended studying improved fuel tank protection. The Naval General Staff congratulated the Kanoya Air Group and authorized decorations. The concern about vulnerability was noted and filed away. The victory was too complete to question. The Betty had proven itself spectacularly. Fawcett Z was destroyed. The British Eastern Fleet withdrew, but the seeds of future disaster had been planted. The Betty could reach targets and destroy them brilliantly, until it met determined fighter opposition. That opposition was coming. August 7, 1942. American Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. By nightfall, they had captured the partially completed Japanese airfield. The Americans renamed it Henderson Field. They would defend it with fanatical determination. For Japan, losing Henderson Field was strategically catastrophic. The base threatened vital supply routes to the south. Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters ordered the base neutralized immediately by any means necessary. The nearest airfield with sufficient striking power was Repulse, 650 kilometers northwest. The Misawa Air Group base there operated 27 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. Their mission, destroy Henderson Field and the aircraft operating from it. August 8, 1942. 0800 hours, 23 Betty bombers prepared for launch from Repulse. Each bomber carried 60-kilogram fragmentation bombs and incendiaries. Each had a crew of 7. 161 Japanese aviators would fly this mission. Most would never return. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai led the fighter escort 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. The Zeros were magnificent aircraft, maneuverable, fast climbing, with exceptional range. But 18 fighters to escort 23 bombers across 650 kilometers was insufficient. The formations took off and headed southeast. Flight time to target, approximately 2 hours. At Henderson Field, radar operators detected the incoming raid at 0940 hours, approximately 50 aircraft inbound from the northwest. Distance 120 kilometers. Marine Fighter Squadron 223 scrambled. 19 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters launched. Captain Marion Carl and Captain John Smith led their divisions into climbing turns toward the contact. The Wildcat was inferior to the Zero in most performance categories. It couldn't turn with Japanese fighters, but the Wildcat was rugged, heavily armed, and could absorb tremendous punishment. 650 caliber machine guns in the wings. 300 rounds per gun, mixed ammunition load. Every fourth round was an incendiary tracer. The other rounds included armor-piercing incendiary. This ammunition combination was specifically designed to ignite fuel tanks.